What's going on, everybody? Gunnar here, and today we're not going to do any tying. It's going to be a lot of talking, but basically I've had the opportunity this kind of tying season to give some presentations on Predator tube fly design, and what I want to go over is basically, a 9-inch synthetic tube fly, 6, 7, 8-inch synthetic tube flies. This one is my glide fly, and the reason why I want to kind of do this is because I have these tube fly patterns that I'm going to be releasing this season, and really, if you're not excited about tube flies, there's kind of no interest in the design and the balance and how they fish and how to rig them and all this stuff. And so I kind of just want to go over basic tube flies and really a few reasons why they're exceptional, why they fish so well, and all the different applications and adaptability and tweakability and design things and how to fish them, so that when you watch these tutorials later on, you can really get the most out of them. And these videos then can be heavily focused on tying technique and design and layout, and not so much on all of this kind of theory and application. So I want to split those two so that I don't have hour-long tutorials, which I do way too often. So this is basically the presentation that I gave on Predator tube fly design. I have it actually up on my laptop to my right, so I hopefully stay on track. And what I mean by Predator tube flies, I should clarify that, I'm talking about flies that are designed to be stripped, not swung. So if you look at like a classic tube fly design, a lot of them are in a sea trout, salmon, trout style. They're typically fairly small, a big tube fly might be 3 inches, and they're designed to be swung. And one of the things that I get really kind of nerdy about is Predator fly design, and the reason why is streamers, bait fish imitations, a 6-inch bait fish imitations. It takes fly fishing out of that salmon trout realm, and it applies it to every single big game predator species on the planet. So when you're talking about tying a 9-inch perch imitation, like, that's significant. Like, I can fish a fly like this for striped bass and barracuda and bluefish and peacock bass and northern pike and muskie and smallmouth and largemouth, like everything that eats another fish, taimen, like seriously, like stillwater, big, like lake brown trout, lake trout. Like, we're not talking about, swinging a 3-inch streamer in a creek anymore for salmon or trout or anything like that. And so it's really exciting me, because fly design and streamers, big streamers, it takes it out of that realm and applies it to every single predator on the planet, and that's what's exciting. So these flies, they're not designed for a straight line swung retrieve with water pressure, but they're designed for a strip retrieve, animate with slack, like animate, pause, right? So there's going to be a little bit of slack in there. Animate, pause, heavy strip, straight line cast, straight line retrieve, still water situation, big lake situation, cross current situation if you're in a drift boat, and it's a really cool thing. So before we talk about these designs and these patterns, let's talk about why you might be interested in tube flies. So basically, what we're going to cover is durability, adaptability, and tweakability. Now, tweakability is a made-up word. I couldn't find a better word for it, so I made one up, and I'll define it when we get there. So check that out. But the biggest thing is that the hook and the fly separate. They are not the same thing. And give me a sec. So here's a tube fly. I just rigged it with a hook. Now when a fish comes and smashes this thing, he just comes up and eats it, boop, the hook pulls out, this slides up your leader, and he just got this hook sitting in his mouth and he's just chewing on it. Now guess what? This hook isn't dressed, so I don't care if I'm fishing for pike or muskie or bluefish or barracuda and they're just gnawing on that hook. It doesn't hurt my fly at all whatsoever, right? So this isn't in their mouth, it's not getting mashed. Now that's something that I find beneficial, important, useful, it's durable. But the biggest thing for me is that when I'm trying to get a hook out of a fish's mouth, right? When you're reefing on that hook shank with your pliers and you're getting all of your material that's tied down to the top and you're trying to find the bend, maybe you can't even see the hook because you have material everywhere. You don't know where the hook is and how to get it out and where that bend is so you can back it out, right? The fact that this separates, all you have is clean access right to the hook. You can see everything. You don't have any materials in the way. And your pliers, which are probably the biggest devastator of a fly, I could care less if I'm grabbing this hook shank and beating it up because it's not dressed. Now, aside from that aspect of durability, the other thing is your fly is no longer limited to the lifespan of your hook. A lot of times if you're using a thinner wire hook, they dull out, especially for fishing for smallmouth, largemouth, peacock bass, things that have really bony, hard, structured mouths and pads, and you're driving that hook into bone and stuff like that. They will dull out. Well, guess what? Yes, you can sharpen it 2 or 3 times, but it's not going to solve the problem. I can just change the hook because the hook and the fly aren't one unit. And so I should basically address this real quick. I'm going to go get some leader material and show you how to put this on a leader because that's a hard thing to understand. The fact that the hook and fly can separate, then how do you rig it? So give me a sec. Now these flies, I'll get to rigging later, but they are designed to be fished on nylon coated stainless steel to maximize your action. So assume this is my fly line coming down, boom, leader material right here. So this, ignore this end, this is the end we're working with, this is our tag end, this is connected to my fly line. So what you're going to do, you simply take this tube, thread your leader material through it, boom, it's pushing up through the back there, grab that, you take your hook, you tie your knot. I would recommend using a uni knot for any sort of monofilament, which you can use, but we'll get to that. And if you're doing steel, I'll show you guys how to build your leaders so that there's no knot bump. But basically what you're going to do is then slide that down to your hook. Now this has something called junction tubing in it, which again we're going to get to, but then you just pull that in place and that'll suck into that junction tubing, controls the orientation of the hook so it's keeled, and that's how you rig it. You literally just slide it onto your leader, boom, tie on your hook, pull the hook inside the tube, and then when you catch a fish, it slides up the leader. This is all free. Check it. Now, something I want to talk about that's crazy cool to me as a tyer, because my time is valuable, is the adaptability of these flies. Now this is a big 9.5 inch perch imitation, right? You see this thing? Now imagine that I put a hook on here. This doesn't have a hook, it's a tube fly, right? Imagine I put a hook on here, single hook fly. If I get some short strikes, that kind of sucks, right? A normal fly tying situation, this is on a hook. I can't do anything about it. I have to tie a new fly, maybe with a stinger hook, or move my hook farther back in the fly, something like that, right? This fly, not so. I can just tie a stinger hook rig. Oh, I want a bigger presentation. I want something maybe with more hydraulic. I can tie on a wiggle tail rig. I don't have to tie a whole nother fly for a stinger or for a wiggle tail or for a wiggle tail rig with a stinger. Or you can dress your hooks now, which are completely bare with rattles, and it's not impeding your tying area whatsoever. So now I have basically 4 options. Is a single hook, stinger hook, wiggle tail with a stinger, and then if I add a rattle to all 4 of those, it doubles it. So you'd have to tie 8 flies for all of those presentation styles, 8 flies in one color combo. So if I wanted this in a natural and a perch and a white and a lemon head, something like that, you're talking every single time you'd have to tie 8 flies in every single one of those colors. You'd have to tie those 4 colors, 32 flies. 8 times 4, I can figure that out. 32 flies just to have all of those rigging options in those color combos. That's a lot of time behind the vise. Or I can tie 4 color combos and have 8 rigs, right? That's significant. That saves you a boatload of time behind the vise. The other thing I want to talk about, and this is the last thing on the list, I can change my hook's orientation. So when I suck that hook into that fly right here, right, I did it so that my hook was hook point down, to keel this fly. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of Kelly Gallup's flatliner or a stealth fly, but basically they're designed to ride on their side like a wounded bait fish. Now, if you're fishing a floating line, I can take this hook, back it out, put it in 90 degrees so that it's pointed hook point down. I don't know if you can see that, but hook point down, and now my fly rides up on the surface flat. I changed the keel of my fly, just like that. And now I can fish this on a floating line up on the surface. I can put a cone head on my leader, and now it's jigging side, like complete profile to the fish. Boom, complete profile to the fish. Instead of jigging like this, which is a little bit weird, because if you think about how a fish is seeing that, it's kind of like this. And wounded fish flutter up on their side, and then they try to dig down, and they flutter up on their side, and they try to dig down. So being able to change my orientation 90 degrees and have this jig flat side to a fish, extremely effective. And I can just change that presentation on a whim, just like that. Completely different fly, even though it's the same fly. You see what I'm saying? So that's pretty cool. Now, we're getting to my made-up word here, which is tweakability. Basically, when I talked about how this fly doesn't have a hook, right? A normal fly would have a hook. Now guess what? If that hook didn't have enough keel weight, if it wasn't a big enough gap, if it wasn't having enough wire thickness for this fly to ride through, well, this fly basically goes in the garbage and I have to tie another one. This one, I can just change the hook. I can change it to a 6/0 SL12S. I can change it to a 6/0 TP610. Not only can I do that, but I can add keel weight to the hook right at the eye. We'll talk about why it's right at the eye. Basically, if you put it at the back, your fly's going to tip back, which is one of the problems we're going to get to. But I can add now keel weight to my hook. I can change my hook. I can change the hook to match the fly. If my hook's too heavy, if I don't like the way it casts, if it's not keeling right, if it's too light of a wire for the predator fish that I'm going after and I have it straightened, it's not set in stone. That's extremely significant. The design when you're done is not set in stone. Imagine you tied a stinger ring and you put, say, like a 2-watt stinger hook and it's really heavy and your fly is tipping back. Change it to a size 1. Boom, it's going to be more balanced. You took the weight out of the back. Maybe your stinger was too long and it was dipping back. You can shorten the length. You can change your stinger rigs. Like, nothing is set in stone. Yeah, so basically, like a normal fly, you tie it. That's what it is. If you don't like the way it works, I'm sorry, but that's your situation. This is not the case. Tube flies, you can finish the design, you can tweak the pattern, hence tweakability, after it's actually tied to get it to ride the way you want. Now, there's a certain limitation. You can't just fix everything, but if you get close, right, you have that ability to kind of shift that variability to land on the spectrum that you want, to get the action that you want, to have the fly swim the way you want. So those are kind of the 3 overarching reasons why you should be interested and excited about Predator tube fly design. Now we're going to kind of nerd out on a bunch of fly design aspects and basically go over in depth the glide fly. Now, I tied this fly for an outfitter in Brazil. I basically spent my entire season trying to get this to do everything I wanted, and hence that's why there wasn't very many pattern videos last year that I released, because I basically put everything on hold and focused everything on this glide fly. So let's jump into that and check it out. So the first issue that I kind of ran into was really just a rigging issue. That's all it was. And it was extremely frustrating because I tied a bunch of flies and kind of did it wrong, and there's a hard way to salvage it, basically. And so basically what you want to do is just look at this. This is from the top view. So imagine you're at this fly and you're looking at it. Whoop, it's down in your hands. You're looking top, overview. So you can see my hook eye. That should indicate the view that we're in. So you have your hook. You suck that hook eye into something called junction tubing. Your junction tubing is attached to your tubing. Now, most tubes are thick enough, like a large tube, a large rigid tube, that junction tubing is going to seat on there. You don't have to do anything to it. It's a tight enough seal that there's not enough friction for that to slip out. If you use a smaller diameter tubing, I will build up the back of my tube with thread to increase the diameter so that won't happen. So I just want to make you guys aware of that real quick. That'll come up in the tutorials big time, so just be aware of that mentally. If there's not enough friction, basically your junction tubing will just slide off your tube while you're fishing, and then you can't control your orientation. You need that junction tubing to be very secure to your tubing. That way the hook slips out and not the junction tubing slipping off. Now, something I want to point out is that junction tubing needs to be long enough to seat your entire hook eye, all of it. The reason why, if you look at the lower picture, if it's only seated in there halfway, it's basically just squeezing your hook eye out. Again, you can't control the orientation. And something that I mentally forgot to do the first couple flies that I tied was leave room for your knot. That top picture has enough room for my knot attaching to my hook so that I still have enough room to seat my entire hook eye. Now we're using big, large Predator hooks, and I'm going to get to the hooks because I use two very specific hook models for a reason. And something you want to look for is when you're using your hook holder tubing, you want it to be sized large with a thick outside diameter. This thick walled tubing is basically going to be stiff enough that the hook eye, which is going to push into it, will get sucked in. If you use a really light walled tubing, basically the tubing's just going to compress and it won't actually absorb the hook eye. So you want to use a nice thick kind of rigid junction tubing to absorb your hook eye. Okay, so moving on. So basically the first thing I wanted to address in this pattern was balance. If you look at traditional kind of Predator tubes, a lot of times basically the tube is weightless. So you have all of your material dressed at the front of this, all of it dressed at the front of this. On a weightless tube, so all of this is hinging on your tie-in point, then you have a big, say 4/0, 6/0 Predator long shank hook to move that to the middle of the fly for increased hookups, but it's not dressed. The hook isn't dressed, the hook has no water drag. All of your water drag is on something that's weightless. Now this creates an issue because when you strip this fly, boom, it will tip back because all this drag is resisting all that hook, which has mass without friction, is going to dip down. Now that's wasted energy. That's energy that was going forward and it's now tipping into a vertical plane. Not something I wanted. So check this out. I tied all of these glide flies on a weighted tube to get balance. So now I have all of this material drag, all of this viscosity, and it's basically, if you think about your hook, the longer shank, the heavier the wire, the more mass you need in the front to balance it. You can balance mass with mass. Boom, done. Now all of my material viscosity and drag and all this stuff that's attached is basically on a heavy tube so that my hook and my tube sink level. Now there's still an issue with a long shank hook. Again, the longer the shank, the heavier the wire, the more mass you need. Now I wanted a fly that was basically going to suspend, sink very, very, very slowly if it did sink. So something I did is instead of having a long shanked Predator hook, I went to a very short shank, extremely aggressive, basically almost like a tarpon hook or extremely short shank Predator saltwater hook. So that way my hook is right here, and these are smaller flies so I can get away with that, but it's right here in the third mark of the fly. And so now I take the leverage, the moment force of that hook being a long shank hook with a bunch of mass right on the bend, and I shorten that up into my tube so that it has less leverage over my tube, if that makes sense. So now I have a short shank with a weighted tube, balance each other out. The hook doesn't have enough leverage to tip it back, and the weight of my tube is addressing all the viscosity of my material. Fly sinks level. Coolest thing about this, basically, well, two things. One, this fly is designed as a jerk fly. They're high and tight. Now, in order for a jerk fly to jerk, as you guys might know, one, it has to be keeled, but two, the energy has to stay on one plane. It's super important. Again, that fly that was tipping back, that's energy going up and down, vertical. If I can keep this perfectly level, all of it goes forward, that head catches a little bit of water, boom, massive profile show, pike muskie, inhale the crap out of this thing, right? Wicked cool. Now, you have to keep that level so that all of it stays level and it's not going whoa, and it's not going whoa. You want that perfect profile show, completely level, stall right on the side. That was a happy accident. Now something I want to talk about is basically momentum. This is something that if you watch my hot fuzz tutorial, this is something I'm playing with. If you watch my, my mini death grip tutorial, this is something I'm playing with. And it was a happy accident. Basically, I was just trying to solve a problem with the hot fuzz collapsing. So I added a little bit of mass so that it would keep going a little bit, and that material would have water drag on it so it would hold that silhouette. But something that was really cool is it pushes into your leader. Now this was something that's massively significant for a tube fly, which we're going to get to on the next fly, or the next slide. But momentum is everything. There's so many people who design flies to swim. Now this is great, but the problem is that is swimming kind of with its tail, and the fly just tracks straight. But all of these flies, all these tube flies, and most of my flies in general, but they're designed to swim head first. They're designed for the head to change direction, not the tail. Obviously the tail is supposed to move and have a little limpness, and that can just be done with basically hydraulic and material selection. It doesn't have to be, you know, super in-depth. I would rather have a fly do this than a fly that just does this. To me, this is way more erratic, and every time you get a fish that's following this, I can kill this and get a perfect profile show, which is a trigger mechanism for a fish to eat it. Because how can I eat this safely? What's my moment of opportunity? How can I stun and grab this fish? And when it shows its profile, that's it. That's your selling point. Does that make sense? So the fact that this fly is designed to swim head first, so that all has to do with momentum. Because if you think about fly fishing, and you strip this fly, all of your line stops, I have this massive water-resistant fly, it's just going to stop on a dime. Boom, it stops. It has no freedom because the whole system is tight, because this has more drag than anything else in the system. It basically stops everything for me. That's not ideal, and it doesn't have any slack. Now we're not talking like slack like I can't feel it and I'm gonna miss a hook set and I'm not tight to my fly. I'm talking like inches of slack here, just like that slack, that slack. Right here, the fly can't do anything. Right here, whoom, whoom, whoom. You see what I'm saying? So this weighted tube, short shank hook, it adds mass. And weight, just really simple, momentum, mass times velocity. That's it. You increase the mass, you increase the momentum. The whole point of this fly is that it has more mass than it does water drag. So that when I strip it, it doesn't stop, it keeps going. Even if it's just an inch or 2 or 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. But it creates something called leader push. Now the biggest design implication of a tube fly is the leader goes through the tube. This crazy important. If you think about almost every other hooked fly, I've preached for a long time, I learned it from Kelly, but basically loop to loops, man, loop to loops bring a fly to life. Why? Freedom, right? That fly can turn, it can turn and it can pull a leader. It has way more action. It's not boom, tied to that, you know, really stiff knot, and it can't turn or do anything, but the moment it's a loop to loop, it has life. The problem with the tube fly is the line goes through the fly. So the only way basically for a tube fly to have any life in it is if it has to physically bend your leader. And a tube fly can't bend your leader if it has more water drag than it does momentum. It has to have momentum to push the leader to create slack in the leader, even if it's an inch of slack, so that it can bend it. That's how you get the flies to come to life. Something I want to talk about is I was using these weighted tubes for balance. Now, when I tested these, the guys in Brazil, nomadic waters, they run typically heavy mono, like 30, 40 pound heavy mono. Now, the problem with heavy mono is it's ridiculously stiff. Now, these tubes, if you go to like a heavy tube, what's really cool is that the heavier the tube, the more momentum, when it creates that slack and it starts to turn, it has more authority over a stiff leader. So you can get away with a stiffer leader in a weighted tube. Now, something I learned kind of the hard way, but I tested all of my flies on something basically nylon coated stainless steel. Really high strand ratio, like 49 strands, so that it's flexible. Now, 30 pound stainless steel wire leader versus 30 pound hard mono. Night and day difference. Steel leader, much more limp, much more flexible, much more, it takes the slack from the fly because it's pushing into that wire leader, and the fly can turn and breathe and move, zigzag and do some pretty crazy stuff. Wire leader will bring these flies on a whole different level than mono. Now, when you're using a smaller fly, if you know that you're fishing for wipers, stripers, smallmouth, largemouth, and you want to fish mono, that's great. What I recommend, because this is going through the fly, check out things like PowerFlex, like 25 pound PowerFlex, 20 pound PowerFlex. It's monofilament with the same breaking strength, but like half the diameter because it's not designed for abrasion resistance. That mono, way more limp, brings the whole fly to life because it's not resisting that fly bending and turning, because it has to bend your leader in order to swim. crazy important, okay? The kind of downside to tube flies, because this needs to be transparent, they are not easy to just switch flies, switch color combos, switch rigs. You basically have to tie a knot every time because you're going to be cutting something off. So the way around that is basically when you rig this, I'm going to take that this pre-rigged fly that I just did, right? When you do this, that's important. There we go. I'm going to do a perfection loop at the end of this. So this is my leader going to my fly. It's already rigged, right? I just rigged this. And I'm going to do a perfection loop, and I'm going to make it big enough to accommodate, man, I haven't tied knots in a while. But I'm going to make it big enough so that I can fit my entire fly through this perfection loop. So when I want to take this off and change color combos, instead of cutting this, sliding this off, putting on a new hook, retying a knot, cinching it down, which is really time consuming with wire, now I can just loop to loop this off my leader, and the loop is big enough that I can fit my whole fly through the loop. Now you're not dealing with always having to re-rig and do knots and your leader getting shorter and shorter. Once these flies are rigged, just leave it rigged. It's that simple. The only time you need to cut and redo stuff is if you're changing from a single hook to a stinger hook to a wiggle tail rig, if that makes sense. So that's, I just leave it hooked, rigged with a big perfection loop, big enough to fit over my tube fly. That way I can just boop, swap off, change colors, change size, do whatever you want to do. Now I want to talk about the basic layout for a tube fly, at least the way I do it. And so this is what's really interesting is these are the same recipe basically. I just changed the material, longer, more bulk, and it's actually slightly simplified, but it's the exact same basically process. And we're going to get pretty nerdy on materials, especially flash boo, so bear with me. But basically I build all of my flies with one intruder bump. And so I'm taking my tube and I'm putting a core, perfectly round cylindrical core that's flaring all of my material top and bottom. But it has no water weight to it because all of the material is separated, so you don't get any kind of water viscosity staying within the materials because it's all flared away from itself. Yet in the water, it has this perfect kind of teardrop silhouette, and what I use to create the illusion of bulk is flash boo. And we're going to get to that in a second. But basically, big intruder bump, wings stacked top and bottom, a little bit of flash dressed down the sides, creates a perfectly fusiform shape, which is just generalistic. You can obviously stack this, add wing stacks to get it higher and higher, and you can do a spread fly head to get it really high and tight. You can do a round bulkhead and stack more material on the side to get round and tubular, more like a sucker profile. So they're very adaptable to the silhouette of the forge that you're looking for without changing any of the techniques. So it's not like this is set in stone, it's just a platform. But a big 360-degree intruder base, wing materials off it, make a sculpted head. The intruder base and the head material are typically the same. The reason why is I'm trying to get X amount of bulk, wing stuff over it, create this identical amount of bulk so that the head and the bump are completely uniform and I have a clean silhouette. So there's no like weird flares in here whatsoever, but my bump and my head designed with the same material, which in this case is strung fuzzy fiber, but you can adapt that to whatever you like. Now the way I like to tie this, and I just explained it, I'm trying to get all of the bulk in that third mark. And kind of the reason why is it's really slippery. It doesn't have a lot of drag on it, and again, we're trying to get momentum. We're trying to get a fly that goes through the water seamlessly and can turn and create leader push. So that's one of the reasons why I tie them almost all as kind of jerk flies. Again, you can do it bulkier, but you got to figure out a way to get more momentum than you have water drag to create freedom. So I tie them, basically all of the bulk is located at that third, tapering down the 2/3 mark to create the silhouette with longer fibers down the back, shorter on the belly. And what's really interesting, I have probably twice as much material on top of the hook than I do on the bottom. That's what that 65%, 35% is. I'm trying to get more material on the top than the bottom. And when you think about a fly riding true, basically this fly is going to sink. It has a little bit of tube weight in there. It has your hook weight in there. This fly is going to descend. Now when it descends, it's going to take the path of least resistance. If you have more viscosity on top than you do on the bottom, all of that material viscosity is slowing this fly down. If you have a lot of viscosity on the bottom, it's going to flip and put the viscosity on top because it's taking the path of least resistance. So I almost always design my fly so that I have probably twice the amount of material on top of my fly than I do on the bottom, and the bottom is sculpted truer to shape, and I let the back kind of run free because this is all water displacement on the back. And that's going to help that fly, when it sinks, to sink absolutely perfectly true and ride the way I'm intending, which is keeled. Oh my gosh, I completely got distracted and forgot to add this. Time out. Flashaboo. My dudes, Flashaboo. Let's check this. This fly, extremely sparsely dressed. If I put this in front of a light, you can see my face through this fly. Do you see my hand? You can see through this fly. Very sparsely dressed. Now, this fly has Flashaboo blended throughout all of the material steps. When you look at my glide fly, it has Flashaboo blended through all of the material steps. There's a flash wing on top, a flash wing on bottom. We're using Steve for our flash blend. We have flash stacked on the sides. Why? Okay? So I'm putting this in the middle of this video probably. In order for a fish, basically all fish are shiny, right? All fish are shiny. And what you have to understand about Flashaboo is Flashaboo only is reflective if there's a light source. So you don't have to worry about Flashaboo basically in a low light situation, because if there's not light, then it can't reflect that much. Obviously there's some really aggressive colors like opal, right? But if you use like a matte gold and some silver and a little bit of steely blue, like these are very natural flash colors. If there's not a lot of sunlight, they're not that bright. If there's a lot of sunlight, they are bright. That's true to how fish are. So I almost always have flash in all of my flies. Now something that's really important is a fish in nature, like in order for a part of a fish to reflect light, to be shiny, well, there's actually something behind it. There's mass. And so if I sparsely dress this fly and you can see through it and it doesn't have any flash, that's kind of odd. But if I dress this whole fly really, really sparse, really low water weight, really low viscosity, but I add flash, it gives the illusion that there's actually more to it. Because it's reflecting light, fish are going to interpret that as there being more mass than there actually is, because in order to reflect, there has to be mass. There has to be something there. So using Flashaboo throughout an entire fly, sparsely dressed, but it's everywhere so that the entire fly is reflecting light, gives the illusion that there's more there than there actually is, even though I have an extremely aggressive intruder bump, very fine, thin materials creating a silhouette. This has no water. I can cast this 7-inch fly probably 60, 70 feet with a 7 weight. This thing has nothing to it. All intruder bump, everything's winged. Everything that's winged is slightly flashy so that it's reflecting light to give the illusion that there's more there than there actually is, but really it's just sparse materials dressed over an intruder bump to create the illusion of bulk. Flashaboo's everything for illusion. Flashaboo's everything for illusion. So something I want to go over, because if we talk about all these wonderful things about tube flies, but I don't articulate how to fish them, you're kind of missing an entire piece of the puzzle, like half of it, right? So something that I learned the hard way when I was down in Brazil is basically, man, long cast, straight line retrieve, low rod tip pointed straight at the fish, extended out with a straight hard strip. That's hard for me because I do a lot of wade fishing, a lot of close quarters, like 15 feet cast, jerk strip retrieve, smaller flies that I'm trying to swim cross current. Totally new ball game. And something that's extremely important, I'm going to get to a little demo here, but you have to keep your rod tip at water height. We're going to get to that. You have to point that at the fish. You need a no slack system for sensitivity, for being able to set the hook. But the thing about your rod tip heights, check this out. If your rod tip is parallel with the water surface at like waist height, so it's like 3 feet high, you're gonna get this massive bow in your line. Now every time you strip that, that fly has a bunch of water drag, and you're trying to overcome, it stopped, now you're trying to put it in movement, all that water drag you have to overcome with your strip, and it's gonna cause that bow in your line to bounce perfectly straight and then slack again, perfectly straight and then slack again every time you strip that. Now that line is rising and then falling. That fall is adding tension to your line. Your line, when you do a hard strip and your line's pointed right at that fly, boom, your rod tip's at water level, super important. Your fly line's gonna stop on a dime. Your fly is gonna push into your leader and it has freedom. The moment you raise that rod tip up, and now you have this big bend, it's jumping up and then slacking down, that fly line now is not stopping, but it's keeping going. It's gonna keep going as that line falls and rebows. So your fly now is pushing into your leader, but your leader keeps moving and your fly never creates slack. You have to fish your rod tip at water level, pointed at the fly. Crazy important. Now the one thing I'm talking about is a little bit anti-jerk strip retrieve, is this is designed for a big water, still water situation, big river situation, and what you have to understand is when you're fishing still water, if you start jerk strip and retrieve, a lot of people will jerk strip faster than they'll basically jerk faster than they strip, or they'll jerk more line than they strip, and they'll start to get out of position. And one of the things that basically is you're just creating a non-linear path to your fly, which is creating slack. So if you get it eat, you have to move more line to drive the hook home. If you just leave the rod right at the fish and just do straight hard strips, you're going to be tighter to that fly in a no slack system so that you can feel the eat, drive the hook home. And one of the things about a jerk strip that's not consequential in a short system, in a moving water system, is it puts you in position if you get it eat to set the hook with the rod, or if you get it eat to strip set, right? That's great. But in a still water situation, a big river situation, a long cast situation, you have to strip set, or you are probably going to miss over half the fish that eat your fly. You have to strip set. It's the biggest issue with people actually landing fish on a fly rod. It's the strip set. You can watch any video and some guy's going to get it eat 30 feet away and he's going to trout set. The fish is on for 3 seconds and then he throws the hook. You have to strip set the fly. It's crazy important. If you just point this at a fish, your rod tip's at water level and you're just doing a straight hard retrieve, boom, he eats it, strip it. So one of the things that I came up with is a little mental, something to just like meditate on while you're fishing. Imagine you cast out 60, 70 feet and your rod separates and all you have is a rod cork and you strip, you get it eat and you're like, oh no, what do I do? You can't physically, if that's your mentality that all you have is a cork, you have to hand line that fish. It's the only way to do it. And if that's your mentality, it'll kind of re-trigger your brain from just reefing every time you get it eat. And I got some ideas to kind of help you through this later on in the season, but that's what I want to cover for now. So what I'm going to end you with, basically everything we've talked about so far, there's a tube in front of a hook. Not a bad way to fish a fly. But something I want to talk about to end this is you can put tubes between hooks and you can put tubes at the end of a hook. So check this out. So this is just a bucktail deceiver. Cool. Now I tied a bucktail deceiver with a stinger in it and I put a tube on my wire in between the two hooks. I don't know if you can see that stinger, but this fly probably has twice the amount of bulk because I was able to dress that entire space by putting a tube in between two hooks, right? And something that's really interesting, if you take this to a trout context, a lot of times trout guys are really interested in their fly looking like one thing, one clean silhouette. It's not like two flies jointed, but it's one fly, right? Even though there's two hooks and spacer beads. Now you can replace spacer beads with a tube, you can dress the tube, and now you have a seamless continuous fly. Boom. I thought that was really cool. I haven't played with it much because I've been too busy with this and it's winter and things are frozen. But I just want to share that because I think it's really cool. The other thing I want to add, putting tubes behind fly. Now, if you haven't watched it yet, I'd highly recommend you go to my Build a Beast video. That's probably the clearest I can articulate this is that entire video. It's one of the coolest things. Let me go get a fly real quick. This is a Build-A-Beast. And all of this bucktail is just dressed on short little tube sections. Wiggle, 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 right? You're talking like a 14-inch predator fly, stripers, pike, muskie, offshore fishing, GTs, like this is crazy cool. And all it is just tube, threaded onto wire. So check out this little photo album. If you haven't seen my Build a Beast video, hopefully this is a quick little sell to go check it out. But basically, all these little tubes you see at the bottom of your screen, I just tied them one at a time, that short, flared my bucktail as I went up. I'm going to thread these all onto wire that's dressed on the back of my hook. Boom, you can see them going one at a time using little glass spacer beads. You can also put weighted beads, like tungsten beads in there. Creates hinge points and momentum in the tail of your fly. Now one of the things that happens, all these bucktail stacks has a lot of water drag. Right? You can imagine that. Well, if you have a really stiff core and you strip this and you don't have any weight in the tail just stops. Now the bucktail still moves because the bucktail's flared, so you'll get movement from the bucktail. But when you add a weighted spacer bead, that fly stops, but the tail keeps going, whoop, creates hinge points. That's what you get when you weight the tail in between your tube sections. Ridiculously cool. And then I finish that with something I call a slide lock stopper bead. And then I put a little metal crimp at the end so that that bead can't ever slip. And I leave enough room so that I can cut that crimp off, get access to that nylon stopper bead, and then I can change out all my tubes, change color combos, replace things that are damaged, cut things closer if I want it denser. Basically, you have full reign over tweakability of the fly after you tie it, and then I'll put that little crimp on there so that it's 100% good to go, and that is your finished product. This is your finished product. Really cool fly, right? So that's everything I think I have about tube flies. Hopefully that helps you guys out. And what I'll end this with, and maybe this should be in the front, but this is kind of how I film videos, just kind of, you know, on a whim. But I'm going to zoom in real close and show you guys the two tools that you need to be able to tie tube flies and kind of how they're designed to work. So check this out, and then basically thanks for watching. So this is an HMH standard vise. You can do this with the HMH Spartan and I think some of the other models, but all of their jaw systems are just threaded in place. So I can take that mag jaw off, which by the way is like the greatest predator jaw I've ever tied on in my life. Boom, I have an inline chucked tool system. Don't need that much pressure on there. Now when I'm tying on a stainless or on one of my copper tubes, I just chuck that literally into place. Boom, done. I can tie on this, it's not going anywhere. Now if you're tying on a large rigid tube or a plastic tube, which by the way you can tie this fly on a plastic tube, but I'd recommend keeling it or adding some sort of weight to the tube to help counterbalance it. But what you typically do, and I'll cut this so it's a little bit shorter, is you would run a pin system through this tube, and then you can insert that pin and it'll go right dead center. Then I'm locking this chuck around my tube so my tube can't spin, and my tube is reinforced and it's not flexing because it has the pin through the whole system. So that's how you tie on that. Now for everybody who has a normal jaw system, let me put my mag jaws back in here. HMH, all this is HMH gear by the way. This is, you know, HMH Tube Fly Converter, the weighted tubes, HMH copper tubes, large, small. They have hook holder tubing, HMH tubing, right? The large plastic tube was a large rigid tube from HMH, so this is where I'm getting all this stuff. And you can just get it directly from the website. But they also make a product that's designed to accommodate any vise on the market to hold tubes. And so this is their little adapter tool here. And one thing that I'll mention is this has a little knife right here. I'm going to zoom way in, hopefully. Get this thing hyper focused, so we're super close in. You can see this little boom, little bump right there, right? Now when you put this in here, you want to get this, basically something I'll do. So I'll heat this end of my tube, or I'll end of my pin up, so that my tube will kind of melt when it gets to it. Don't burn yourself, by the way. And now my tube is going to melt right up into that, and I have it really, really, really tight to that. You start pushing this in here. You get it close with just a little bit of tension, and then you want to, that's still a little hot, but you want to push that in and lock that in place. And so what that knife is doing is it's gouging that plastic tube so that that tube can't spin. You don't have to say go way up here, put the tube under here, and then clamp it down. You can, right? But this gives you access all the way to the back of your tube. I went the wrong way with that. All the way to your back of your tube, and that little knife blade stops this tube from being able to spin with thread pressure. And then again, you can just put your weighted tube in there and tie in that. So that's how you have access to be able to do this with any vise system on the market. Now lastly, I'm going to keep this zoomed in here right on my vise. I want to go over the last step to all these flies. So when I'm tying, I'm just tying on a straight tube. There's no junction tubing on this. Junction tubing is the last thing that I do. And so what I'll do, and again, cut it so that you have enough room for a knot. Super important. But because these have a massive intruder bump, you kind of just flare the material and it all goes away from that tube. And I'll hold this all upside down, so all I have is my bare tube. You guys see that? Let's make sure you guys can see this because this is important. All I have is that bare tube, and then this is the last step. Now this is a large tube, so this isn't dressed. This is just a raw naked tube with naked hook holder. And I'll just push that in place. You can be pretty aggressive with these flies. I'm not worried about hurting anything. I'm not worried about my head. And we'll get all to that and when we start doing the recipes. But that's 100% good to go. I need about that much room. And we'll see if we can find a Kona hook. Oh, man. But the two hooks that I use, this is a Kona, which is a new hook company, Big Game Hunter 4/0. Extremely important. The reason why, nice, thick gap, wide gap, thick wire hook with a smaller hook eye that fits perfectly into this junction tubing. And so you'll, basically this is how junction tubing works, but you just dress that just like that, good to go. Make sure that that's perfectly vertical in there, hook eye fully enclosed, and then that is your tube fly. But the second hook, because I got distracted there. So the two hooks you need to know, and sorry for putting this kind of randomly in here, but the two hooks you need to know, Kona's Big Game Hunter in a 4/0, extremely short shank, wide gap, thick wire hook with a small hook eye that fits perfectly into the junction tubing for these smaller flies. And then the second hook is Gamakatsu, makes an SL12S 1X short. That's the hook. The 1X short model. Both of them, they're almost identical hooks. They fit perfectly into this. They keel these flies ridiculously well, so they ride true. They're both extremely sharp, short enough shank that it's close to my tube, so this doesn't have a lot of leverage, and I can get away with using my light tube, which isn't going to sink as much to balance it out. If you use a longer hook, thicker wire hook, longer shank, you're going to want to use a heavier tube so that you're balancing the mass with mass, so that it's riding level and staying on a linear plane. So, that's everything I have about tube flies. I don't know yet how long that video is going to be, but it's probably going to be close to an hour. But thank you for watching. If you made it this far, hopefully that excites you about tube flies, and you can check out my glide fly tutorial, which I'll have up in the near future. Check out the basically Glide Fly XL. It's a Mark Sedotti Slammer Variation on a tube for pike and muskie. That thing's going to be coming up. If you haven't yet, go check out my Build a Beast video. This is Bob Popovic's Beast Fly, a variation on the tying technique to make it accessible to everybody, so that you don't need to be super ridiculously skilled to make a 14-inch fly. And yeah, thanks for watching.